Hi, I'm Don Blackwell, and this is Aaron Gallagher. We'd like to welcome you back to another episode of Answering the Error. This program is different from many other programs in that we examine videos that teach religious error, and we expose that error in the light of the Bible. We always try to be kind, and we try to be respectful toward those whose videos that we are examining, and we always reach out to the speakers on those videos, and we invite them to discuss us, debate their views on these topics. But we believe that when we are dealing with a matter as important as one's eternal salvation, we cannot afford to not expose error. Now, the video that we're reviewing today is entitled, "Why Do Christians Worship on Sunday and Not Saturday?" The fellow's name is not given in the video, but we have reached out to him. We've let him know that we're going to review his video. He has responded. He doesn't seem to be interested in discussing this with us, but we have extended the invitation. Aaron, can you give us a brief overview of the video that we're going to be talking about today?
Sure. So this video was submitted to us by a viewer, and so we watched it and we reached out, and I believe his name is Casey. And he responded back and said that the things he taught are just the views of the Catholic Church. And so hopefully maybe he'll change his mind and want to communicate with us a little bit further, but we let him know we're going to review the video, and so we're going to do that now.
Okay, let's roll the video.
For millennia, even up till today, Jews have observed the Sabbath on the seventh day, Saturday, keeping it holy with rest and worship. And yet Christians, for some reason, ignore the law and worship on Sundays. What gives? Some have suggested that it's simply switched days, that we no longer observe it on Saturday, but it's still the same Sabbath, just celebrated on Sunday. While seemingly logical, this is not correct.
All right, here he suggests that some people have suggested that the Sabbath has switched, that in the Old Testament the Sabbath was Saturday, in the New Testament the Sabbath is Sunday, and then he says this is not correct. I was glad to hear him say that. Mm-hmm. I think the reason that people have done this is people are still trying to bind the 10 Commandments today. Mm-hmm. And they get to the fourth commandment, remember the Sabbath, keep it holy. They don't know what to do with it. Mm-hmm. And so what they say is, well, the Sabbath day has switched. And so that was the Sabbath in the Old Testament. This is the Sabbath in the New Testament. What's the problem with that?
Well, you're exactly right. First of all, he's right that the Sabbath did not switch from Saturday to Sunday. But you're exactly right. The reason people do that is they think we're under the 10 Commandments. And if anybody watching is the first time you've heard this, there's a passage in Romans chapter 7. And Paul is saying you have to die to the law to be married to Christ. You can't follow the law of Moses and be married to Christ. And he says you're dead to the law. Well, what law is it talking about? In verse 7, what shall we say then? Is the law sin? Certainly not. On the contrary, I would not have known sin except the law. For I would not have known covetousness unless the law had said, thou shalt not covet. Well, what is that? That's a quote from Exodus 20 and 17. You look in the Old Testament, that's from the 10 Commandments.
Right.
So he says you're dead to the law that said, thou shalt not covet. Someone says, so I can murder. No. Of the 10 Commandments, 9 of them are restated in the New Testament. The only one not restated for us to obey would be the Sabbath.
That's right. That's right. And in fact, in Romans chapter 7, his point is if you're still holding to the law, the old law, and the new law, you are committing spiritual adultery.
That's exactly right.
Okay, let's keep going.
Great.
What is often overlooked in this issue is the clear distinction between the official Sabbath and what came to be known as the Lord's Day. You see, after the resurrection, the early Christians continued to observe the Sabbath on Saturdays because they still saw themselves as Jews. They went to the synagogue, observing their required period of rest, but also began to celebrate a new feast, the Lord's Supper. While there was no mandated time for this celebration at first, and some celebrated it daily whenever they had a meal, it almost immediately became associated with Sunday, the day of the week when Jesus was resurrected.
All right, there's actually several things here. First, he mentions the Lord's Supper, and he says that in the beginning, there was no mandated time for it, he says, at first. Of course, he is completely wrong about that. Mm-hmm. There was a mandated time for the Lord's Supper from the very beginning. When was that?
Well, you can look at New Testament passages, and you look at Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, where it says on the first day of the week they were gathered together. And that word that they were gathered is actually passive in the Greek, which means, well, who gathered them? They didn't gather themselves. They were gathered by someone else. It was by God. I mean, you look in Paul in that later in that chapter, it says he was in a hurry to get to Jerusalem for Pentecost. But in Acts 20, he waited there for 6 or 7 days. Yeah. Why did he wait there for 7 days? Number one, if they didn't have a day to take it, Number two, if they could have taken it on any day, as if he said. He made the statement, well, you could take it daily. So that's not right either. So
Yeah, that's the second thing that I wanted to mention. He says that some of the early Christians celebrated the Lord's Supper daily when they were having meals. There's nothing in the Bible that teaches that. Where's he get that idea?
he's getting that from Acts chapter 2, and I believe it's verse 46. And this is what it says. So continuing daily with one accord in the temple and breaking bread from house to house. They ate their food. They were breaking bread, not the Lord's Supper. It was their food with gladness and simplicity. And that word there, I believe is trophy, which is sometimes translated meat. It means nourishment. It's 16 times in the New Testament, and it's never used at the Lord's Supper. I mean, even Greek scholars like A.T. Robertson, Barnes, Linsky, Vine, all of them say this is not the Lord's Supper. So he's saying they celebrated it daily by taking a passage that's talking about regular food and trying to act like that's a Lord's Supper passage.
One thing people need to realize is when you see the phrase breaking bread, it can mean one of two things. It can refer to a meal, it can refer to the Lord's Supper, and the only way you can tell the difference is the context. In Acts chapter 2, if you look at verse 42, he talks about breaking bread, and it's referred to as the breaking of the bread. You've got the definite article there, pointing to the Lord's Supper. It's included in verse 42, along with the fellowship, prayers, the apostles' doctrine. It's in the context of religious things. That's the Lord's Supper. When you get to verse 46, the context is completely different. You're in people's houses. This is happening day to day, and as you said, is tied to eating nourishment. The context tells you it is not the Lord's Supper. Aside from this verse, that's their go-to verse. Aside from this verse, there is nothing in the New Testament that would indicate that you can partake of the Lord's Supper on a daily basis. He's just made that up.
Well, 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, Paul basically says, I've commanded other churches, and it says in 1 Corinthians, maybe 4:6, that he taught the same thing in every church. He said in 1 Corinthians 16, as I commanded other churches, I'm commanding you, that you're supposed to give a offering on the first day of every week.
Right.
Kata is the word for every in that session in Greek. And then you look in 1 Corinthians 11, well, when did they partake of the Lord's Supper? When they were gathered together.
Right.
So they were gathered together on the first day of every week.
That's to partake of the Lord's Supper.
To partake of the Lord's Supper. Right. That's exactly right. So they didn't do it every day. There was a specific day.
That's absolutely right. All right, let's keep going.
Scripture shows us that this tradition dates all the way back to the very first Christians, with St. Paul speaking of a collection being taken up, and the Acts of the Apostles describing the time to break bread, both of which taking place on the first day of the week.
All right, I know we have a lot of material to cover here, but he refers to them partaking of the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week, and he calls that a tradition. What is the problem with that language?
Well, the word for tradition, it basically means something that's handed over. And so the Bible uses that phrase of tradition in two different ways. There are traditions that came from the apostles, which are ones that came from God. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, I believe it is in verse 15. Therefore, brethren, Christians, stand fast and hold to the traditions which you were taught by word or epistle. So if it's a tradition from the apostles, their speaking or their epistle, we follow it. Now, there's another type of tradition that the Catholic Church holds to, which is the traditions that they make up.
Right.
And so it's interesting to me that he says there's no specific day, and then he actually gives a specific day.
Right.
I mean, Paul said in 1 Corinthians 14, the things I write are the commandments of the Lord.
Right.
So it's a little odd to say there isn't a day, and then we have direct passage that says that there is a day.
And he even references the Apostle Paul and the apostles, and 2 Timothy 3:16, all Scripture is given by inspiration of God. That is, it's God-breathed. It came from God. And the apostles stated these things. So there is a mandate. This is not tradition from the Catholic Church. These are the days that God mandated. This is the day that God mandated.
And the end of that verse you just brought up says, when you do these, all Scripture is given by inspiration. It's profitable for doctrine, reproof, correction, instruction, and righteousness. That what? The man of God may be complete, thoroughly equipped for every good work.
Every good work.
Which means when you look at Scripture, everything you need is in Scripture.
That's
and
right.
Jude 3 says the faith was delivered once for all time is what that word hapax means. So it's delivered once for all time. So you don't need a man-made tradition added later. The Scripture is sufficient in and of itself.
Absolutely.